Thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's Wednesday webinar, Understanding Anti-Vaxx Communities on Social Media, with Dr Aliaksandr Herasimenka, a postdoctoral researcher in the Computational Propaganda Project. He will be joined by Professor Philip Howard, Director of the Oxford Internet Institute and Principal Investigator for the Computational Propaganda Project. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website in due course. Post questions using the Q&A tab at any time. These will be answered at the end of the talk. Please keep questions as concise as possible. They will be visible to all attendees and you can upvote them. We will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Philip and Alexander.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening to you if you're in a distant time zone, and welcome. I'm Phil Howard, Director of the OII, and it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Herasimenka. He is certainly one of the world's leading scholars of misinformation and disinformation, having published, written several different kinds of working papers, published scholarship on Telegram, Twitter, multiple platforms. And over the last few months, he's turned his eye as analytical skill set to the problem of misinformation around public health, certainly a kind of social problem that has dire consequences for those that get caught up in it. It's pretty clear that there are heavy industrial interests and national governments interested in promoting misinformation. And Alexander has done a fabulous job being able to map out, in a sense, the flow and direction of this messaging and how it hooks up with some of the social movements that have existed for quite a while in countries around the world. So we'll have the research presentation, about 20-25 minutes, then we'll come together for questions. And Dr. Herasimenka, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for this warm introduction. Well, indeed, over the last months, me as part of our research team at the Computational Propaganda Project, we've been looking at most interesting aspects of information that relates to vaccination and information that can help us to understand what type of information about vaccines been circulating online. Before starting the presentation, I would like to say thank you to the Oxford Martin School and its program in media science and misinformation that was very supportive of our research, as well as our research team. Jonathan Bright, Kate Jones, who is one of our greatest specialists in all things related to public health, Alexei Nutila, and George Ioan. We've been working on questions of information about vaccination online since summer 2020. So most of the information, it's still an ongoing research. And most of the data, most of the analysis I will present right now, mostly relates to summer and autumn 2020. So it dates about 5 months back. But I will also mention a few interesting ideas that is related to very current research we're doing right now, and data analysis we're doing right now. I will talk briefly about anti-vaccination thought and what does it mean to express anti-vaccination narratives. We discuss which social media platforms host this type of information. And we also perhaps note a few things about who produce this content, how people make money from it, and how big this content is on social media. As well as we offer a few recommendations and ideas how to address the issue of anti-vaccination narratives online. So why is this important? Why should we care about anti-vaccination thought on social media. Many countries are now rolling out their vaccination programs, and their success partly depends on how many people would take vaccine. In the UK, at least 24% of the surveyed population say that they are not ready to take vaccine if it's available to them. It's the latest survey from December 2020. If you compare to other countries, this number doesn't sound that bad, right? In Japan, for instance, about 40% of the population says they're not ready to take vaccine, it's available. In France, it's more than 50%, in fact, about 60%. And in the UK, in fact, a number of people who would be ready to take vaccine been growing over last month. Still, it is a substantial number. And people who are not ready to take vaccine can motivate it with different reasons. And one of the reasons is knowledge and their understanding of vaccination narratives. On the internet, we might find a lot of information about vaccination. And if we turn our attention to websites that we sometimes call junk news websites that often spread misleading information, we might see that many of them, in fact, share disinformation about vaccination. Like, for instance, this website, News Target, shared a news story that suggested that COVID-19 vaccine changes human DNA, claim that been shown it's not true at all by the scientific community, but in fact many other news websites that share similar misleading information followed. How can it affect population? How it can affect people's action? 6 months later, after this story appeared across many websites and social media, we heard the story of a US pharmacist who attempted to destroy almost 600 COVID vaccine doses because he believed that vaccine changes human DNA. If we generalize this type of narratives, we might find that, according to a very recent UK study, the number of people, the percentage of people who are ready to take vaccine, definitely ready to take vaccine if it's offered, drops from 54% to just 6.4%, sorry, from 54 to 6.4% if those people been shown online misinformation about vaccine, from 54 to 6.4. That's a significant drop. So misinformation about vaccination seems to be a significant issue. But overall, this vaccine hesitancy, this anti-vaccination thinking is not, of course, new to this country. It's been around for a while. This idea that vaccines are risky, they're unnecessary, inconvenient, they've been around for a long time, since vaccine been first introduced in the 19th century. And this type of narratives been periodically boosted by all type of public health events, such as public health emergencies, like now we experience during COVID-19 crisis, but also during introduction of new vaccines or appearance of all types of reports and news stories that claim that vaccines are in fact unsafe. And what we've seen now across the UK is that even before COVID-19 crisis, vaccination rates showed concerning decline. And this decline, of course, is not just because misinformation or disinformation might spread online. It's also related to people's concerns, very legitimate concerns about safety of vaccines. And it's okay to have those concerns, but sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes people see that type of information that simply mislead them. And this information more and more often appears on social media. So recent research showed that pregnant women in the UK who use social media to research vaccination were 58% less likely to accept vaccines after doing this research on social media. Other research demonstrated that vaccine uptake is lower amongst parents who trust social media, and similar results we've seen for the UK and the US. And it means that we need to understand more about what type of content circulates on social media, how it spreads, and who produces it. I will present a few case studies from our research that answer those questions I mentioned. And the first case study is about social media platforms that host anti-vax content. What we did, we monitor a number of social media platforms. In fact, we did investigate 14 of them, 14 social media platforms. And we found that anti-vax content is present on all of them. You can find this type of content if you just type in vaccination, vaccine, or sometimes you need to use special hashtags used by anti-vaccination communities, such as learn the risk. We did this, we kind of repeated user behavior for each platform we monitor, Facebook, Twitter, but also smaller platforms. What we found is that when it comes to bigger platforms, that's what type of social media we think about when we say a social media platform, right? Like Facebook or Instagram. We found that it's not that easy to discover social media anti-vax content on those bigger platforms. Still, it's possible, and most importantly, anti-vax stories not dominate those platforms, but they definitely present, and communities of those people who identify themselves as anti-vaxxers, they are quite big on large social media platforms. When it comes to smaller platforms, such as Parallel, depicted here, that became prominent recently, we call them sometimes fringe platforms. Those platforms, they don't have that big audiences, right? Their audience is smaller, not in billions of users. Nevertheless, there's quite a lot of anti-vax content on them. And this content is much easier, normally easier to discover than on bigger platforms, such as Twitter or Facebook. So who are those people who produce anti-vax content? We found there are three main types of them. The first type, we can call them activist groups. Second type are anti-vax personalities who are prominent across those groups. And finally, there are mainstream celebrities who just famous and occasionally share anti-vax content on their social media. So remember, we're talking about social media realm, first of all. The first type of producers, activist groups, they're numerous and they unite around this issue or worry or concern about vaccination. In the UK, one of the largest one, called Annika, it has about 35,000 members. 35,000 members, quite a lot, right? And they have about 100 local groups across the whole country. And they are mostly present on Facebook, at least in summer. Their online home was Facebook. Multiple Facebook groups, we found at least 55 of them, who help those people to unite, discuss the issues, and advocate anti-vax ideas and vaccine hesitancy across wider population. The second group are those personalities who are prominent across those anti-vax activist communities. They often produce anti-vaccination content, as well as other type of conspiracy theories as well, and they invest quite a lot of efforts and money and resources in their production. They build the whole media empire sometimes in order to disseminate that content. In other words, they use influencer type strategy of interacting with their audience, and they have hundreds of thousands of followers. And those followers help them to convert attention that they receive to their content into something else, like money, for instance. And the third type of content producers, or rather sharers, are people who can be described mainstream celebrities, prominent personalities that not necessarily belong to anti-vax communities, but sometimes might publicly express anti-vaccination sentiments or opposition to vaccination. Like, for instance, Novak Djokovic did this summer, famous tennis player. What's important about them is numbers of their followers. They have millions of them. And if those celebrities share a story that might be described as anti-vax, that might expose millions of their followers to this story. That's what it's important. Some of the content producers try to monetize their content, and we try to understand how they do it. So we looked at about 300 pieces of content that was randomly selected from more than 200 vaccine content producers and shared later on social media. We try to trace this content back to websites where this content comes from, to their producers, and found that every single producer we looked at, every single one, tried to make money from their content. About half of them tried use donation infrastructure, like PayPal donations, for instance, or other type of donation ways, crowdfunding, in order to essentially collect money. So sometimes to sustain their communities, but sometimes for profit. The second most popular type of monetization was advertising, and also, of course, many of them shared information products, movies, merchandise, and been selling those products through platforms like Amazon, for instance. In fact, we try to trace connections between anti-vax websites, so those websites that spread anti-vaccination ideas, and other websites. And it's possible to do using and tracing analytics infrastructures, tracing advertising infrastructures, advertising platforms that have been used by anti-vax producers. And we found several networks, like one depicted on your screen. You see green nodes are websites that have been spreading anti-vax ideas. All the rest are just websites that sell health products. So we found interesting pattern across some producers who create a number of websites that maintain anti-vax ideas, and then they advertise health products, saying that you better not to take those vaccines. You rather go and buy on that website, other websites, health remedies that might be very helpful to sustain your health or curing you, and you would not need those vaccines at all. That's how this business model works. And it shows, in fact, that anti-vaccination industry can profit from anti-vax content and raising vaccination hesitancy. How big this problem on social media? We try to measure the audience of anti-vax producers across a number of platforms on social media. So this time we didn't use this sort of manual search like we did in the first case study. We collected information about around 15,000 pieces of content that belong to more than 200 websites. And we found that if you compare the potential audience, so people who might see anti-vax content on social media, we found that, in fact, on average, there are not so many, the audiences of anti-vax content are not that big compared to mainstream media, for instance. Mainstream media, we mean things like Guardian, like Daily Telegraph, for instance. But when it comes to platforms, different platforms. So the previous picture was for aggregate audience. This time I show you a picture about every single platform we looked at. And you see that on some of them, anti-vax audiences are quite big. For instance, Instagram has quite big, comparatively big audiences compared, for instance, to public health authority websites. Though I should mention that over recent days, over recent months, public health authority content been gaining more and more attention, larger and larger audiences on social media platforms. So they're doing better in that respect. When it comes to engagement levels, similar story. Engagement might be not that high if we compare to other type of conspiracy theories or misleading information that we define as junk news. But when it comes to comparing it to public health authority engagement and engagement with anti-vax content, we might see that numbers might be quite similar. So in other words, people, what we call engagement is all type of activities people take when they expose to content on social media. Like, they press like, they might share content, they might comment on it. What happens when people see content? They do these engagement things. And we see that sometimes the level of engagement can be comparable to mainstream media engagement, that to the stories that discuss health issues. Finally, we also used our content analysis capabilities and reviewed around more than 400 pieces of content that can be described as anti-vax, junk health, or junk news producers. And we found that most of these pieces of content that discussed vaccination, most of them expressed safety concerns about vaccines. So this is the key concern that we can see in anti-vax narratives: safety, and also lack of trust. Many narratives we discovered on those anti-vax websites, on social media, they show lack of trust in public health authorities, in vaccine producers. Finally, people question necessity of taking vaccine. So what can be done about this problem? I think previous slide also shows that we need to address those narratives. But in order to address them, we need to think about the ways of approaching them online. So for the last few minutes of this presentation, I will just present you with few ideas we came up when working with this content. Obviously, we didn't experiment. We didn't try to introduce those ideas. We just basically we look at literature review, but we also, when we studied content, we looked at content and thought which of those ideas might work best. So look at the first idea. One of the critical problems with anti-vax individuals is that they are often more informed than pro-vaccination people. They just did their research and they know possible consequences. They're very well informed, and in fact, very often. That means that treating them as ignorant is not productive. What we should do is obviously address misinformation problem, but we also need to think about target messages, messages that would appeal to certain specific types of population, more informed people who did their research. We should also think about messages that would try to debunk misinformation about vaccination in specific linguistic communities, for instance. In other words, this countering misinformation about vaccination strategy should take into account diverse population and diversity within the social media audiences. The second solution is solution been often discussed across and by everyone who is involved in any type of discussions about content moderation, about disinformation. And it involves, of course, more proactive stance of social media platforms in tackling the problem. They might try to delete content, add warnings. That's what they've been doing actually quite actively over last year in response to COVID-19 pandemic. And we noticed that, in fact, it works. We noticed that a lot of content on bigger platforms, on platforms with larger audiences, a lot of content about vaccination is marked, and somehow there are warnings added to this content. So this moderation strategy works partly. Nevertheless, what happens if individuals are essentially kicked off platforms? Whether they disappear? What happens to prominent anti-vax thinkers or producers that I mentioned when they are removed from platforms? They're not disappearing, actually. They just move to other platforms, smaller platforms that are less regulated. And this is another great issue. In fact, their audiences also at least partly move with them to those new platforms. And final way to approaching this problem is to think about the ways they earn money, and this would mean attacking monetization strategies I mentioned. So I mentioned a few of them, right? You remember? One of them, most popular, was donation infrastructure. So perhaps platforms that provide space for donation might somehow review their regulation, like PayPal, for instance. It's a very popular platform for collecting donations. Maybe those platforms should review their regulation in relation to anti-vax communities. Platforms like Amazon, YouTube provide several opportunities for anti-vax communities to earn money through selling their products, through providing space to advertise products, and it means that we need to think about how those platforms, how those organizations approach this dilemma, and how they may cut off some of the funding sources and sources of revenue for the communities I mentioned. With that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention, and would be very happy to discuss these ideas and our research during Q&A session. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for taking such a careful tour through your research. While we get ready for questions, let me remind everybody to, yes, please drop them into the Q&A. And of course that you have the option to upvote questions. So we'll have I have a quick question for starting us off, and then we'll turn to turn to the list of open questions in our Q&A and start to offer some answers. You know, I'm curious, while everybody gets a moment to read the questions and do some upvoting, I'm curious if you find as a researcher that you have a straightforward sense that the information is wrong and should not be there, or that there's a freedom of speech issue here involved, and that, you know, if the policy recommendation is that Amazon stop selling anti-vax stuff, and this is actually one of the good questions that's already been asked, is expecting the platforms to really take action, does that become an infringement of speech, or is it an acceptable infringement of speech, or is it not among the things that you think about as you do this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. I believe what we've seen constantly, continuously, while we research this type of content that is questionable, that sometimes can be harmful, that we sometimes can define as disinformation, right? With that type of content, we need to be very careful indeed and think whether any type of attempt to moderate it might cause any disputes regarding freedom of speech issues. What I think this research shows, that there are different types of anti-vaccination narratives, and some of them could not be easily considered disinformation or misinformation. In fact, they sometimes they express legitimate concerns of people who might experience any kind of health issues, for instance, and they might link these health issues to their health, to vaccination, to vaccine taking, for instance, when they were younger, for instance, or they might heard of similar problems experienced by a member of their family, for instance. So they might went through difficult situations in their lives, and they totally have, I believe, right to be concerned on that and discuss these issues on social media and on internet. But there is other type of information about vaccination that might be harmful, that been shown as in fact totally misleading, and this type of information should definitely be addressed by by policy interventions. And clearly it feels to me that platforms like Amazon should take more proactive stance, but it would also require from them to be more careful in moderating content. It doesn't mean that they should remove all type of narratives that express vaccine hesitancy. So it's a huge dilemma, and dilemma that of course goes beyond this anti-vax discussion.
Certainly. Certainly. Well, let me point out that there's two great questions that have emerged. The first one is about a little bit about method. Can you tell if there's a split? This is from one of our doctoral students, Hannah Kirk. Is there a split between the kinds of communication that emerges over text versus image, or perhaps over language inflection, the multimodal forms of communication? Are they consistent, or is there split messaging?
Absolutely, yeah. That's other crucial question that we discuss all across these information studies. And what we found is that it depends on type of content producers. So if we look at content produced by rank and file anti-vax activists, like members of Arnica community, for instance, or members of other smaller groups on Facebook, for instance, those type of people, they often focus on text, maybe images. But if we look at bigger producers like I mentioned, this type of prominent personalities within anti-vax communities, they often use videos to promote their content, and that's what I would say the key medium of conversation with their audiences. Video is very powerful too, but it also requires maybe some time investment in terms of resources if people want to produce more quality video, which means that it's not available to every anti-vax producer, and we'll see that it also affects messages and also affects audiences. It seems like personalities, anti-vax personalities, gain larger audiences, as I mentioned, thousands of people following them. Also, not least because they rely on video as a key message tool, as a key medium. That's what I can conclude. And also, of course, recently what we've seen, both public health authorities as well as some anti-vax producers been quite successful in promoting messages through image format, but especially public health authorities, they rely very often on combination of images and text to explain vaccination program in the UK at least, and we've seen they've been quite successful in terms of engagement. They receive a lot of engagement and people clearly interested in their messages, which is a good sign.
Mm-hmm. So building on this, there's the next couple of questions, one's anonymous, one's from Albinani. Can you tell, just by studying the content, if the influencers who generate this stuff actually believe their positions, or do you think it's a monetization thing? And then I think similarly, why hasn't mainstream media been able to generate, with all much higher production values and also using multimodal communication? Why haven't they been able to respond in a way that effectively marginalizes the misinformation, the stuff we know to be false and damaging?
Well, yeah. These two are important questions. Monetization is indeed might be one of the ways just to sustain the community. So we should first look at the source of information. Very often, crowdfunding is the only way for smaller anti-vax communities to continue functioning in a way, to pay for their website servers, for instance. Or sometimes they also, especially in the US, they're involved in various law disputes. And this is also the way to sustain this type of engagement. And it seems to be, it looks like that they genuinely try to collect money for their actions. But when it comes to other type of producers, like mentioned prominent personalities of anti-vax community that produce a lot of video content, or people who both advance and advertise anti-vax beliefs as well as various health remedies like coconut oil, for instance, those people seems to me might be engaged in an attempt to extract some revenue from this situation, unfortunately, and it seems like they might earn on this current health crisis. That's why it's very important to try to cut off the ways they can collect money and also distribute their for-profit content. When it comes to the question, which you will kindly remind me, what was it about? The second one.
The ability of mainstream media,
Yeah.
mainstream actors to generate rival content and disseminate rival.
Yeah. The second question is
messages.
Yeah. That's what we've seen actually across other types of disinformation content as well. It seems like that in terms of audiences, in fact, mainstream media definitely doing better. They have bigger audiences very often. Their audiences are millions of people across this country and beyond. But when it comes to engagement with their content, very often content that might be described misinformation or disinformation, this type of content attracts larger, higher levels of engagements. And why is that? Well, perhaps one of the reasons is because this disinformation content is more sensational. It's just screams with sensation, and people click on it. They want to know what's going on. That might explain partly why engagement levels are that high, as well as, of course, this content often disseminates across people who might be described as those sort of hard believers in anti-vaxx ideas, and they just follow every single bit of content they see that confirms their bias. It also explains, partly can explain this situation. Clearly, mainstream media, we analyzed, and we did it in summer. Importantly, to remember that it was a bit about 5 months ago we looked at it. Mainstream media back then didn't really discuss vaccination at that level that they do it now. So perhaps when we come back to this study and we are going to analyze this type of vaccination scale again, anti-vaccination narratives spread again, we might see that mainstream media might be doing a bit better in that respect.
Okay, so we have a sort of a methods question from Sophia Mo about the factors that go into distinguishing junk news. I guess, what are they? And then, if, as you say, the original sample was collected in the summer, would you change anything, or have things changed since you did the original scoop?
Yeah, well, we maintain a long list of sources we describe as junk news. We identify them based on very rigorous procedure of content analysis that involves several researchers, and they should agree that it's an example of what we can describe as junk news. What happens is that those sources constantly evolve, they change, and new appear, and some of them disappear. Whole networks sometimes develop into communities of 20, 30, 40 junk news websites that are linked to each other. We're constantly monitoring that list of sources, and definitely when we reiterate and go back to our summer data collection, we would update our list of junk sources clearly, yes.
And then there's another good question, anonymous. Before I summarize for you, let me remind everybody to please add questions. We've got 31 of them and about 20 minutes left. So do also have a look over the ones that are already in the Q&A and upvote the ones you think capture what you're interested in. One of the top questions at the moment is what's surprising here. In some ways, the misinformation campaigns often have the same kind of structure and same kind of punch. Was there anything that surprised you here? Maybe things that are, is there anything that's surprising relative to the other misinformation campaigns that I know you've studied? Yeah,
well, indeed. There are not so many unusual things until, of course, well, some people are very deep in this question and they follow all type of misinformation studies, and they know very well that engagement is often high when it comes to misinformation, that it's present on all platforms. At the same time, I think our study reveals and differentiates between misinformation producers. It reveals that some of them, in fact, try to monetize their content, and there are not so many studies that do this job when it comes to misinformation studies. There are not so many attempts to trace back their revenue sources and understand how exactly they might make their money, and whether they try it or not, and if they do, what happens. And other surprising finding for me was that in fact it appears that some anti-vax communities are linked between each other deeply, though they don't look like linked at all. And well, indeed, we might suggest that some misinformation campaigns on political misinformation also might be linked, but it's not easy to demonstrate this link, right? Empirically, what I think we did with network analysis, we demonstrate links that might be substantial for understanding their motivation. So that's what I think one of the key surprise for me.
Fabulous. In your, I mean, of course, not fabulous, it's awful, but in your sense of how these communities emerge, I guess the arc that they take on social media, is it possible that ignoring them is best? When you study them, or if you act against them, you may create martyrs. This is a question from Claire McLeod. You can create martyrs in the anti-vax community who become persecuted and perhaps raise the ire of even more followers, or inspire even more direct action or more fundraising. Is there some trade-off here? You know, what you study and call attention to, do you actually elevate it in some way?
Indeed, yeah, there is a trade-off, and we need to be very careful when we suggest that certain communities or certain people, especially if they are prominent, should be banned from social media platforms. Because as I mentioned, what happens very often is that they move to other type of platforms that do not impose very strict moderation rules. And very often they stay there and move together with their audience. So their audiences also move out from platforms that are well monitored, relatively also monitored in terms of researchers' attention, but also attention of platform owners, to platforms that might encourage this type of narratives. And we miss links, we miss trace of those communities once they move out. So of course there could be other suggestions in addressing that issue. And of course, one of the key issue that you also feel discussed in your recent book on misinformation, is that obviously there's issue of data ownership and algorithms that promote this type of viral sensational content. And these algorithms developed by major platforms, and they sometimes elevate misinformation that includes anti-vax narratives. So perhaps addressing the issue of data ownership and algorithms might be one of the ways forward. Because in fact, you mentioned that one of the platforms we studied at a COMPROP project called Telegram, which is in fact now bigger, almost twice bigger in terms of audience than Twitter. This platform doesn't have this viral algorithm, algorithm that promotes content from people you never met, from communities you are not interested at all. And our study shows that levels of engagement with misinformation on this platform are lower if we look at, for instance, engagement with content on bigger platforms. So it's, in fact, addressing algorithm governance is one of the ways forward, looks like.
One of the ways forward, certainly. So there's a really interesting and I think complex question from Lydia Brownlee. She points out that there actually are many communities around the world, India, Africa, African Americans, South America, communities that have had a bad experience with the medical profession, with public health initiatives that have been used and abused in a variety of ways. Can you tell from your research if anti-vax messaging gets different kinds of traction, perhaps on the basis of race or gender? Do different kinds of communities respond in different ways to the anti-vax messaging, and what are those ways?
This is one of the key questions, I think, and other key ways forward that we would recommend as a policy response, because it appears that indeed, just within one country, the response to messages about vaccination programs might differ. And this might differ not just because people have different beliefs or different sort of upbringing and attitude. It also sometimes because people, for instance, certain people who believe who have one language as their first language, they just don't follow mainstream media in the country they currently live, which means that governments should really think careful about designing their messages for different linguistic groups. So linguistic differences is something that governments should acknowledge during the COVID-19 crisis. People should learn about vaccination programs from media and from authorities of a country they're currently located, rather than, for instance, based on the information they receive from their diaspora communities, from the media of countries they're coming from. This is a crucial question and one of the more difficult questions, because sometimes misinformation might also circulate across closed linguistic-based communities on social media, and this is what we cannot penetrate. We can't see what's going on. That's why it's also important to highlight that social media researchers should have better access to data that's been shared on social media platforms for research purposes that would help us to address and answer that type of questions more effectively.
I agree, and I'd only offer that this is also the kind of problem that requires qualitative and ethnographic work to understand what the marginalized community experience would be with misinformation, especially if it's aggressively targeted at them. You make the point a couple of times that the one of your surprises was involved the ways in which seemingly different anti-vax organizations were actually tied up or connected, perhaps through these points of passage that involved websites that sell stuff. Are there ways that the anti-vax movement is connected with other kinds of conspiratorial movements or theories? Liam Buckley suggests QAnon as one of the other possibles. I mean, how many hops does it take to get from a network of anti-vax activists to a number of other conspiratorial communities?
Well, yeah, clearly they might be linked, and sometime, since we've been focusing on producers and sources of anti-vax content, we might comment on how what other narratives those producers will share, and we've seen other conspiratorial very often, especially when it comes to sources that focus on issues beyond vaccination. Sometimes those sources also share other conspiratorial ideas, and it's possible, vice versa, to find anti-vaccination ideas within the communities that are concerned with very different issues that also might be described as conspiracies, such as political conspiracies, social conspiracies. During the COVID pandemic, this all been linked together into sort of large network of all types of beliefs and suggestions that been linking 5G networks to COVID, and then COVID been linked to control, so 5G linked to control, and there is vaccination arrival, so maybe they're also going to use vaccines to control society. All this sort of merged into one huge wire of very weird ideas and beliefs that exist within certain communities. They certainly communicate between each other. But I would say this is more extreme type of anti-vaccination ideas. As I mentioned, there are great number of moderate communities that are not really exposed to this type of more extreme ideas and beliefs. And we, as I mentioned, we should respect them and just target. And public health authorities should think of targeting their messages for different type of audiences, depending on what type of content they exposed to previously, I believe.
Okay, so let's buy the argument that there are moderate anti-vax communities that you'd want to respect and encourage deliberation in. How would you craft a content moderation platform? a content moderation system for a social media platform, right? This is a question from Kit Palmer. Would you prefer that governments, nation states, do this kind of content regulation so that the health messaging is as clear, as consistent as a government can make it, or is this something that the platform should be doing, or would you leave it to those moderate communities to moderate themselves?
Yeah, we see there are many different options, and I feel like actually this is a question for you to answer because you did research in that direction, and we didn't experiment with different approaches, as I mentioned. We mostly relied on literature review for that. So clearly, this is something to be researched later on, or for other people to communicate.
Okay, then let's talk about other people communicating, such as pro-vaxxers. And there's a great question here, also from an anonymous participant, that applies to any domain of Trump-related misinformation or QAnon misinformation. How, knowing what you know, how would you engage with an anti-vax individual in a way that was constructive and constructive and productive?
Yeah, well, this is what we can recommend a few ideas about. Again, once we differentiate between types of audiences and find out that we are dealing, for instance, with more moderate communities, but very knowledgeable people about vaccination, perhaps what we should do is demonstrate every pitfalls, every possible situations when they might encounter health issues if they take vaccine. So in other words, we need to be very open, as much open as possible when talking to those people. If they are knowledgeable, if they already if they have researched the topic, every possible negative scenario that might have developed regarding vaccine development should be revealed immediately. And vaccine producers and governments should be very quick in their crisis communication. If, for instance, a widespread report appears that claim that, for instance, certain vaccine actually previously reported as very effective, now is not that much effective. This type of claims should be addressed immediately, very fast. This is one of the key issues within crisis communication like that. When it comes to targeting audiences with open messages, those messages might include information about how vaccines been developed, how they've been researched, who analyzed their trials. All this type of information should be placed in public domain, translated in different languages, explained to different types of audiences, using different types of formats, video, audio, images. That would increase, I believe, increase trust in this type of information that comes from government.
Even if both sides feel that they're backed up by the science, right? Because the anti-vaxxers, a little bit like climate denialists, will say that they have the science on their side, or that they have the science produced by a certain government.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe still we need to recognize that they have this knowledge, but at the same time, when it comes to science, there should be also discussion what type of science different sides rely on. So the more open this pro-vax science, pro-vaccination science, the high trust I think it produced, and vice versa when it comes to, there was a number of studies that claimed various things about vaccination, linking vaccination to various illnesses. Sometimes they've been debunked, sometimes it's been shown that those studies actually don't work. And this is one of the other crucial question within misinformation studies, how misinformation about science being produced and communicated, and how to address this type of misinformation. This is also a bit of open question, I think, to discuss.
Okay, so let's keep it open. There's a very good question here from Sandrine Tiller. You effectively studied 14, right, different kinds of platforms, and you're able to say something about how much misinformation appears there. Can you tell whether particular platforms have more effective content moderation of that stuff than others? So is Facebook better than Twitter? on content moderation on this issue?
We can say that larger platforms recently been quite effective in terms of moderation. So this realm of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, this type of platforms, they're doing quite good job, in fact, in terms of moderation compared to how it looks, say, 1 year ago. So we can compare not between platforms, but within one platform, how it looked 1 year ago and how things look now. That's what one of the points of comparison. And we compare them to smaller platforms that I mentioned, and those smaller platforms seems to be not very much interested in moderating this type of anti-vax narratives we discussed.
Fabulous, thank you. So we have 2 or 3 minutes left. I'll try to blend in a couple of questions together. In all of your work, have you noticed engagement between sort of well-organized pro-vaxxers or anti-vax respondents and social media organized anti-vax campaigns?
It's a good question. We haven't noticed that type of engagement. They look to us pretty isolated between each other.
So there are some, they just tend not to actually engage with each other. Well, the pro-vaxxers aren't taking.
Yeah, there are, of course, pro-vaccination sort of, or rather, they're not so communities that advocate vaccination, but rather just moderate users.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not tending to engage much with anti-vax communities. It doesn't look like.
And have you noticed if the anti-vax messaging has actually started to target particular COVID-related vaccine projects? So targeting the Oxford vaccine, targeting Pfizer in some ways other than others?
That's been one of the key targets over last half a year, yeah, obviously.
Fabulous. Well, I guess we have another minute or so left. Could you say a little bit about what you'd like to do next, or what would be the ideal next step for this? Because it's such a big social problem, and it's going to be with us as long as at least COVID's front of center for all of us.
Yeah, I believe we need to focus our research on understanding how to better target messages that explain vaccination program to different types of audiences and also different type of content. So we hope to differentiate our research based on type of content people circulate, as well as communities they belong to, and look at how we can better address the problem. So first of all, learn about volume and types of anti-vaccination beliefs that spread in specific smaller communities, and then learn how to address them differently.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Herasimenka, it's been great to have a taste of your research. Thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Alexander and Phil, for a fascinating insight today, and thank you all for attending. You will receive a follow-up email in due course. The OII are hosting their next Wednesday webinar on the 3rd of February at 6 p.m. UK time. Dr. Francesca Sobandi will be hosted by Professor Gina Neff in this first installment of the new Next Gen series. Please visit the events page on the OII website to sign up.